Hello and welcome to the Mr. Brown podcast, where I reflect on my journey as an early career teacher, with a special focus on mental health. I am your host, James Brown. Salutations. That's the new greeting, as suggested by a listener, a colleague, in fact, Mr. K. And poor old Mr. K, he's had a bit of a rough week. On Thursday, he lost his laptop. And on Friday, he lost his voice. He came into school and he couldn't speak, bless him. I happened to tell my year 10s about this, about Mr. K's misfortunes, about how he'd lost his laptop and then lost his voice, and a quiet girl sits at the front, looked very shocked, and she beckoned me to come close, and I said, "Yes, what is it? Are you okay?" She went, "Sir, they come in threes." So I found out this student is quite superstitious, and she believes that Mr. K has got one thing left to lose. Now, it may have been his patience. I think he lost his patience with me at one point yesterday, so that might have been the third thing. But in any case, I hope your voice soon returns, Mr. K. The first thing I want to talk about today is a marking backlog. I think my school has quite a good approach to marking. Well, my department, I should say. I don't know much about the marking policies outside my department, but in the maths department, we do unit assessments every 2 or 3 weeks. And we mark those. The students get their assessments back. They fill in a self-assessment sheet, have a go at some show questions. So with their show questions, they get another opportunity to have a go at the questions that they got wrong in the assessment, and they can show that they've learnt. They stick everything into their books, and then we take the books in and we mark the self-assessment sheet and the show questions, and just have a quick flick through the book to make sure everything looks in order. So we mark assessments and then we mark books after those self-assessment lessons. And I found myself with a big book backlog. This happened because I usually do some marking during my free on a Monday, and I happened to lose that free a couple of weeks ago because there was a maths day. All the year 11s were off timetable and doing maths all day. So I was helping out with that and lost my free. And then the books started to pile up. I ended up with, I think, 3 and nearly 4 classes worth of books that needed marking. And this started to weigh heavy on my mind. It was worrying me. Because ideally you get those books marked fairly quickly, return them to the students, and then the students can see whether they've improved on their show questions. If you leave it too long, then you've kind of lost any momentum. And the feedback, I think, is less meaningful for the students. So I was conscious I wanted to get it done, but there was a lot of it. And it was causing me just a little bit of stress, not too much, just a little bit. A noticeable amount. Now, I seem to have this problem, and I'm desperately trying to overcome it, where I don't start marking a stack of books. So when I say a stack of books, I mean a whole class's books, 30 or so. I don't start marking a stack until I think I can finish it all in one sitting. Now, a stack of books, if I'm going at a good pace, could take me an hour, or just over. That's an awkward amount of time as a teacher. I need a free and probably also a break or a lunchtime at one end of it, at least, in order to get a full stack done. And those frees don't come along very often. And so I found myself, despite having a big book backlog, not starting on any of them, because I wasn't going to start marking a single book until I could do an entire stack in one sitting. And this was very counterproductive, very, very counterproductive, because like I said, it was weighing on my mind. My students were losing out because they were having to wait for this feedback. And in fact, when I think about it, there are lots of little points throughout the day, like 5 minutes here, maybe 10 minutes there, where I'm sat at my desk kind of doing busy work, just filling the time before the next lesson starts. When in fact, I could have marked just a few books, maybe 4 or 5, I don't know. But I could have been chipping away at it. And I think I'd have gotten through those stacks of books much quicker if I'd have done that. Now, it's not ideal because students need their books for lessons. So, fair enough, chip away at the stack of books, but you still need to get it done between student lessons. Otherwise, some students are going to have feedback and some students aren't. So I could be a bit more strategic there and pick the time in the week when there's the biggest gap between lessons for a particular class. And then during that period, just start chipping away at it. That, I think, is the optimal strategy. And so I must get over this neuroses of mine that dictates that I only start doing something when I think I can finish it in one sitting. That's very counterproductive. Maybe it stems from some sort of perfectionism. It's definitely a form of completionism. I don't know whether that's a thing. But it's something I suffer with, and it's something I must get over because I think I'd be far more productive without it. What do you do? Do you try to mark your books in a single sitting, like I've done, or would you chip away at them? I'd be interested to know. Now, in the last few weeks, I feel I had a considerable milestone as a teacher. It was with my Year 9 class, or half of them at least, but I'll get onto that in a moment. It was with my Year 9 class. I was due to do an assessment review. So they had done their assessment in the previous lesson, I'd marked it, and then we were due to go through the assessment together. And they could do their corrections and stuff. But I'd missed an email, which often happens, I'm sad to say. I'd missed an email that would have informed me that half, or more than half, of my class was going to be away. I only had about a third of them. I think they were away on a Duke of Edinburgh trip. But anyway, I got to the class. There were hardly any students there. There were too few students to warrant going through the assessment. And so I decided that the best thing to do would be to push it back a lesson. I'll do the assessment review when all the students are back. But then I had an issue. Okay, so we're going to do the assessment review next lesson, but what do I do in this lesson? I haven't planned anything. I had about 12 or 15 students there waiting to learn. What was I to do? And I made it up as I went along. And despite all of those nightmares that I've had since beginning my journey as a teacher, where I suddenly find myself in front of a class without a lesson prepared, despite all those nightmares, it went just fine. And in fact, in some ways, it was a far better lesson than many of those lessons that I've prepared in advance. For a start, I had a conversation with the students at the beginning, explained the situation, and asked them what they would like to do. Now, there's always the usual suggestions of, oh, sir, can we do a Kahoot quiz? Which I refused and said, no, we're going to do some learning, but let's think about what you'd like to learn. Think about what we've done in the previous unit. Were there any areas you weren't happy with? We had a good conversation. They took some ownership of their learning by suggesting what they might like to do. I had a quick look on a few of my favourite websites for some relevant work, projected them onto the screen, and we were away. So it was a lesson in which these students did indeed take some ownership, and it was entirely adaptive. It just went with the flow. I wasn't constrained by a PowerPoint or a plan, and it was really productive. It was good. And I describe it as a real milestone because, like I said, that was a nightmare scenario for me. And yet I was thrust into it, and it turned out better than a lot of my pre-planned lessons. And I hope that as I become a more experienced teacher, I do gradually start to shed the scaffolding that is PowerPoint. Those PowerPoints are scaffolding for me as the teacher, essentially to remind me what to do. But I've seen some wonderful teachers, my mentor from last year, for example, who seemed to just make it up on the fly. But in fact, he'd been teaching long enough to know exactly what he needed to teach that lesson, and he adapted to students' needs throughout. And so I just had a taste of that recently, and it was good. The following week, however, with that same class, I had a lesson that wasn't so good. And I want to use this lesson to highlight the connection between poor explanations and poor behaviour. I was teaching cumulative frequency graphs. Now, you don't need to know what they are, but essentially, in my initial explanation at the beginning, I threw far too much information at my students. I should have just given them the basics, then given them the opportunity to practice the basics, and then built on the basics. Whereas in that lesson, for some reason, I tried to give them everything all at once, describe every type of variation that they might encounter, and they got quite confused. So I decided to stop just trying to heap information on them. I could see they were getting confused at this point, and instead to just let them have a go at the activity. But I think to some extent the damage was already done. So when they came to have a go at the booklet that they were working through that lesson, the first few questions were what I considered to be just the basics, the fundamentals. But because I'd thrown so much information at them in the initial explanation, they'd kind of overlooked the basics or misunderstood them, and they were struggling. So because they were struggling, they weren't engaging with the task as much as they otherwise would have been. They were becoming distracted more easily, and there was more low-level disruption than usual. Now, on the other side of the coin, there was me, who had realised that I'd ballsed up my explanation, and I was annoyed with myself. And I think that the fact that I was annoyed put me in basically a bad mood and made me less patient. So it was kind of a double whammy effect. I had students who were just misbehaving a little bit more than usual, and there was me who was a little less patient than usual because I was annoyed that I'd messed up my explanation. And so I ended up having what was probably an entirely avoidable argument with a student, and we normally get on so well. Yet we had this argument in this lesson, and ultimately it was all my fault. She was a little more giggly than usual, talking to her friends, but I was less patient than usual. And so I picked a fight that I didn't really need to. And to be honest, I think I lost the fight. That'll teach me. So yes, there's definitely a strong connection between poor explanations and poor behaviour. But importantly, it's not only that student behaviour declines when they don't know what they're doing. I think teacher patience also declines. That's exactly what happened with me anyway. That argument that I had with that student was largely, if not entirely, because I was less patient than usual. So, those good explanations and that appropriate chunking of material is crucial, I think, for behaviour management. Now, from my Year 9 class to my Year 8 class, behaviour can be trickier in my Year 8 class. There are a few characters in there, but I love them all. They're lovely kids. They received some feedback from me recently on those self-assessment sheets, so I finally got around to marking their books, and they got their books back, and they read their comments that I'd left them. And one student, whose behaviour can sometimes be an issue, but she's a lovely girl, she read her comment, and she said, "Sir, you've written here that I should be very proud of this result." And I said, "Yes, you should. It's a really good result." And she responded, "But what about you? Aren't you proud of it? Are you proud of my result, sir?" And that hit me right in the feels. Because sometimes with some students, when I'm writing feedback, I do want to say I'm proud of them, because I am proud of them. And I'd love to be able to say that in person as well. Yet there's some block inside me, or there was anyway. I've made a real conscious effort to address that now. That some students really want to hear that their teacher is proud of them. And so I said, "Of course I'm proud of you." And I took her book and I wrote next to my original comment that I was proud of her result and that I was proud of her. And that seemed to really mean a lot to this student. And I think more generally, a lot of these students want a connection with their teachers. They want a human connection. And with this same class, often when I display something on the projector from a web page, so say if I drag a Google Chrome web page from my laptop onto the projected display so that they can see something, sometimes it's like a BBC bite-sized video or something like that, they'll be less interested in what I want to show them and more interested in my bookmarks that they can see along the top. And the first time I did this, a long time ago now, they all started to shout, "Turkish, sir, Turkish. Why have you got a folder in your bookmarks called Turkish?" They were very interested. And so I explained that I'm learning the Turkish language, or I'm trying to anyway. My partner is Turkish and I'd love to be able to speak to her in Turkish and her Turkish family. So I explained that I was learning Turkish and they took such an interest in this. And I can guarantee that at least once a week, one of them, maybe more, will ask me something about Turkish, or they'll say a word in Turkish to me. I've got several students in that class who speak languages that are similar to Turkish, and so they know a few Turkish words, and so they're very interested. One student keeps telling me that her mum, who does know Turkish, wants to speak to my partner so that they can have a conversation in Turkish. And these little pieces of information that help students build a more human connection with their teachers, they spread around the school. I had 3 Year 9 girls just this past week. I have never taught any of them. I didn't know any of their names. I walked past them in the corridor and they said, "Merhaba, Mr. Brown." They had learnt from my Year 8s, presumably, that I'm learning Turkish. And so they said hello to me in Turkish. And so I stopped and had a lovely discussion, some of it in very broken Turkish, with 3 girls who I'd never met before. And so I think all this highlights how important it is for teachers to have a human connection with their students. And of course you could leverage that relationship in order to improve learning outcomes, but the relationship is valuable in and of itself. I think that the 3 things that any school should provide students are opportunities, knowledge, and belonging. And that sense of belonging comes via those human connections. Right. It's Easter. I don't know about you, but when I've been high on adrenaline for 5, 6, 7 weeks, however long the half term has been, it takes me a while to come down. I feel a bit anxious this morning, a bit jittery. So yesterday was the last day of term. Today's the first day of the Easter holidays. And I think it's similar to when you've done some exercise. This happens to me anyway. If I go for a run, if I'm running quite quickly and then I come to a complete halt and then think, right, workout over, my body doesn't like it. It can make me feel a bit woozy. I can feel my heartbeat going like the clappers. Anyway, what you need after a strenuous workout is a warm down. Some people call it a cool down. A period of exercise that decreases in intensity until you're back to kind of your resting state. So after my runs, I go from a run down into kind of a slow jog and then a fast walk, gradually. And I feel I need something like that with the end of term. Because like I said, I've been living off adrenaline for a good while now, and then all of a sudden it comes to a complete halt and I'm on holiday. And I feel like I'm reeling a little bit. So I don't know what the equivalent of a cool down or a warm down would be for a teacher, but I'll have to try and figure out something. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts. How do you ease into the holidays? Well, first of all, do you have any issues transitioning from term time to the holidays? And if so, how do you ease the transition? Please let me know. This episode took a couple of hours to produce, which is about average. I try to produce 2 or 3 episodes a month. If you think that work is worth the price of a coffee, £2 to £3, once a month, then please consider becoming a patron and helping me cover the cost of producing the podcast. Those costs currently stand at about £13 a month, I think. Thereabouts. Any contribution would be greatly appreciated. As always, there's a link to my Patreon page in the show notes. Have a lovely Easter, and I'll talk to you again next term. If you enjoyed this episode, please spread the word in person and on social media. You can follow me on Twitter at Mr. BrownPod or email mrbrownpod@gmail.com. Please subscribe, rate and review in your directory of choice. Please also consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/Mr. BrownPod and helping me cover the cost of producing the podcast. Thank you, and talk again soon.